Okay, in the previous sections, we had a look at data coming into our jig from dynamic data, and then before that, we had data embedded in our jig in the form of static data. We're going to take a little step forward here with data coming from SQL Azure. So here you can see us in the SQL Azure Studio. We've got two statements that is going to return data from our familiar country table. So if I execute the top SQL statement, we'll see that we get our country data. So if I execute that one, there's our SQL data, and we'll see the second way is that we can take a stored procedure version of the same thing, execute that, and again, we'll get the SQL data. So what we'll do now is we'll explore how we get this data from SQL Azure into our jig. Let's take a quick moment to understand what's going to happen with our integration with Azure SQL. When we get into the code, we're going to see that we write a very simple function which either defines an Azure SQL stored procedure or Azure Dynamic SQL, which will fetch data for us from Azure SQL. And essentially, that data will be returned to the SQLite database. So if we have a look at how we do this, we call the SQL function, it returns to the SQLite database, and that then renders onto the device. So now that we know how this works, let's figure out when we can call it. So we can call it, the creator has absolute control. You can call it when the app loads, when the app refreshes, a pull to refresh event. You can look at a specific jig. When I load, for example, this country data, I can load the data at that point or have a pull to refresh event. All of these events are supported. We're going to look at them in the code. You'll recall from the explanation, the first thing we need to do is we need to go and create a function. So the first function we're going to create is just the dynamic SQL function. So in our functions folder here, I'm going to go ahead here and create a new file. And I'm going to call that file SQL get country data.jigs. Great. And immediately that will give us IntelliSense. We know that we want a SQL function, the connection, and we'll look at this in management in just a bit, but the connection I know for our particular SQL Azure database is jigs1.database.windows.net. The method is a query, and using a trick, which is the cake I baked earlier trick, here is my query. So I'm going to paste that in there. And that's it. So it's basically a very simple query that is selecting the columns from that table. While we're here, let's also go ahead and do the stored procedure to go and get the same country data. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to call this one sp get country data.jigs. And it's still going to be a SQL query. The connection is going to be the same. So let's put that in. The method this time is going to be an execute store procedure. So let's do that. And then again, this time instead of a query, we want a procedure, and that's the procedure that we want to do. So we're all done. What we can go ahead now is let's publish this, and then we can head over to management, take a look at the connection string, and test both of these to make sure they're returning data. When you log into management, just make sure you've got the right context. So you want to start off by going to the left menu, picking the second icon on the left, the solutions icon. In there, you can search for your solution if you have a lot of them. I happen to know mine is called Intro, and I know that mine is Intro DM. So I pick the solution. Once I have the solution in context, I'm then able to go and see all the assets associated with that solution. For the SQL Azure connection, I'm going to go to the connection menu item here. That will load the connections. I can then click into that connection. And here we see a very straightforward mechanism to define your connection to the SQL Azure server. You'll also see here the IP allow list that you need to configure on your Azure SQL to allow a connection from Jigx. Great. We've got our connection defined. What we can also now look at is our SQL functions. And here is a number of them. Remember that we had a couple of them. So the first one we're going to look at is the SQL functions, and we had SQL get country data. If I click on that and click run, it will then run that against Azure SQL, and we can see our record set coming back. Now similarly, we know that we had a stored procedure one, and that was sp dash And again, that was sp get country data. And if I run that one, then similarly, I will see the result set coming back. So what we now know is that we are configured successfully. We can see our connection in the management interface. We're able to return data. All we need to do now is get that data into our jig. Let's head over there and get that done. Okay, here we are back in Visual Studio Code. We're going to go ahead and create a SQL example. Let's go ahead and do that. So we need a new file. We're going to call that list-example-sql.jigx. There we go. We know we want a list in this particular example, and we're going to call this SQL country data. I am going to get rid of the description. We're going to leave the icon. Well, let's just use Apple again. That's easy enough. We're going to leave the default header. Okay, let's take a moment to look at the onFocus event. In this instance, we are going to use it because we need to, when this jig gets focused, we're going to use this event to go and fetch data from SQL. So we've basically just got to configure that. So if we look at the provider, it's fairly self-evident that that should be SQL. The entity is the name of the local SQLite table that will be created. So I am just going to put country in there. Once we have that local SQLite table configured, we also need to call the function to go and fetch data. So again, we can use IntelliSense. We want function. In this case, we want the SQL get country data, and we're done. So we now know that that onFocus event is going to fetch that data for us when this jig gets focused. Now remember, thinking back to our schematic, we can decide when we want to fetch data from SQL. Could be a pull to refresh event in this jig. Also, you can load it when the application loads. You would achieve that by putting this same event inside the index file. So once the index file loads for the application, you can fire an onFocus event and fetch that data when your application loads. Great, so all that we have to do now is continue forward and go and use this data in our data source. Right, we should be getting fairly used to define the data, but let's go and configure this. So we want a data source name here. Let's try and make it something that's representative of what we're doing. So I am going to call this countrydata.sql. All right, what kind of data is this? It's SQLite data because we now have that data in SQLite. So we can take that option. It's local. The local SQLite table that I've populated that we now know is called country. And then basically what I need to do is define the query. Now, again, using the cake that I baked earlier, I am just going to paste that in. And there is our query now pulling data from that local SQL table. So all we need to do now is configure our list. So I'm going to start by just saying the data source is now country data SQL. We can fill that in. And now we just need to configure the list items. We've been through the configuration of the list items once before. I'm again going to copy paste from our earlier examples. Here's a copy paste that we did earlier, so I'm going to get rid of the item level down. I'm going to paste that in, and there we go. So we now have our list configured. It's pulling data from that local SQLite table, and we are then just configuring the various elements in the list. So the title, subtitle, the left element with the icon of the flag, the right element of the GDP, and configured for currency. Let's publish this and go and have a look at it. Okay, before we go and have a look at this example running on the mobile device, let's recall that we also did configure a SQL store procedure. So what we're going to do is just have a quick look at what we need to do to bring the store procedure data down. What we've done is we have created an exact copy of the SQL file. It's literally a copy paste of that. Let's have a look at the changes that we need to make in order to call the stored procedure. So we need some cosmetic changes. I'm going to call this, instead of SQL country data, I'm going to call it SP country data. To make it visually different, I'm going to use the beer mug logo so we can see it. This can all stay the same. Right, here we need to define a new local table, so we're going to call that country SP. And instead of calling SQL get country data, we can call SP get country data. And then in our data source, instead of collecting data or selecting data from country, we need to now select data from country SP because that's where we've put the data. The final tweak is just to change the name of the table that we're selecting from, so we can change that to country SP. We're done there. All that we need to do now is just configure our index. In our index, we're seeing two files, the one that gets data using the dynamic SQL and the second one that uses the store procedure call. Let's go ahead and publish that. And once we've got that published, we can go and switch over to our device and have a look at these in action. Okay, here we are in our application. Let's have a look at what's happened. So recall that we configured two icons. We configured one to go and fetch that data dynamically from SQL and one to do a stored procedure call. Let's go and have a look at what happens. So when we go and press SQL, we'll see that we get momentarily a no data sign and then the data loads. What's gone on there? As we look at the schematic, we can see that what's happened is the application is called SQL, it's populated that data into the SQLite database, and then it's rendered. So if we go back in again now, we'll see that that's absolutely instantaneous, and that's because the data is now in the SQLite database. Similarly, if we look at the stored procedure, we'll see exactly the same thing, momentary delay while it fetches that, and then it's there and it's in the SQLite table. And of course, again, when we look at it again, it's absolutely instantaneous. So other advantages that we have in this architecture is that if I take this device and I now take it offline, I go back into the application, we'll see that our application continues to operate 100% normally. I can see the data, I can scroll it if there was more data available. The data just continues to operate, the application operates 100% normally. Pretty neat. In the next section, what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at how we update data. We can see the data now starting to flow both ways.